Imagine this. It's a cold winter night in a medieval castle. The corridors are lit only by the faint glow of torches. Behind a heavy wooden door, muffled screams echo through stone walls. Inside, a young woman lies drenched in sweat, gripping bloodied sheets. She is not yet 20 years old, but she has already endured 3 pregnancies. Tonight, she fights for her life again. Her midwives hover nervously. They have no sterilized tools, no pain relief, no medical knowledge beyond herbal teas, whispered charms, and prayers. The woman's husband paces outside, not out of concern for her safety, but for the child. If the baby is male, the family line will continue. If it is female or worse, if both mother and child die, then all of this agony will be in vain. This was the brutal reality of childbirth in the Middle Ages. For countless women, bringing life into the world meant stepping closer to death. Childbirth wasn't a moment of joy. It was a gamble one, in which the odds were terrifyingly stacked against them. Historians estimate that in medieval Europe, anywhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 2 women died as a direct result of pregnancy or childbirth. Think about that. A woman could live her entire life in fear, knowing that motherhood might one day kill her. Every pregnancy was a roll of the dice. And yet, society placed immense pressure on women, especially noble women, to bear as many children as possible. Producing heirs was not just a family duty, it was a matter of politics, power, and legacy. A queen who could not deliver sons was considered a failure, no matter how much blood she shed in the process. But childbirth was not only dangerous, it was cloaked in superstition. Many believed that a difficult birth was a punishment from God, or a result of sin. Women were told to pray harder, confess their sins, or wear holy relics around their necks during labor. The church insisted that childbirth was Eve's curse, a divine punishment passed down to all women for the original sin. So, instead of medical help, women received prayers and charms. Instead of doctors, they had midwives whose knowledge was often questioned, and whose practices were sometimes condemned as witchcraft. And when things went wrong, as they so often did, there were no safe options. A baby stuck in the birth canal could mean the death of both mother and child. Sometimes horrifying decisions were made, cutting into the mother's body after she had died, just to try and save the infant. This was medieval childbirth. Bloody, dangerous, and merciless. In this series, we're going to uncover the shocking truths about what women went through during childbirth in the Middle Ages. From the terrifying superstitions to the gruesome medical practices, and from the daily risks faced by peasant women to the tragic deaths of queens. This is a chapter of history that reveals just how fragile life once was. And trust me, you won't see childbirth the same way again. So let's begin by looking at the superstitions and bizarre beliefs that shaped how medieval people understood pregnancy and birth. Childbirth in the Middle Ages wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a deeply spiritual one. To the medieval mind, pain in labor wasn't an unfortunate accident of nature. It was divine punishment. The church taught that the agony of childbirth was Eve's curse. Because Eve had tempted Adam in the Garden of Eden, every woman thereafter was doomed to suffer unspeakable torment. While bringing life into the world, this belief shaped everything about how childbirth was handled. A laboring woman wasn't just fighting for survival, she was supposedly atoning for sin. That meant that medical help was minimal, and spiritual intervention was considered essential. Midwives often encouraged women to clutch religious relics during contractions, bones of saints, small crosses, or rosaries. In some regions, priests would bless a woman's bed with holy water before labor began. Others hung herbs like rue or juniper over the bed, believing that evil spirits caused difficult births and could be frightened away by strong smells. One particularly bizarre superstition insisted that if a woman wore the girdle of a saint or carried a piece of parchment inscribed with Bible verses, her labor would be easier. In England, many noble women begged to borrow the Virgin Mary's girdle, a relic supposedly stored at Westminster Abbey. The belief was that Mary herself would loosen the womb and ease the child's passage. But there was a darker side to this religious obsession. If a woman's labor was prolonged or went horribly wrong, some people believed it was because she was guilty of hidden sins or even witchcraft. Imagine the cruelty of this. A woman in excruciating pain, perhaps dying, being whispered about as if she had brought it upon herself. Some midwives were even accused of sorcery when their patients died, creating a chilling atmosphere of suspicion around the very people trying to help. And while noble women had access to relics, charms, and prayers, peasant women had little more than herbs and folk magic. Some believed tying knots in cords or hair could delay a birth, so households were warned to untie every knot in the home when labor began to release the baby. Others thought certain foods could help or harm. Eating hair, meat for example, was believed to cause a child to be born with a cleft lip, while placing butter knives under the bed was thought to cut the pain. As strange as these beliefs sound, they reflect something chilling: the utter helplessness of medieval people in the face of childbirth. Without medical science, birth was a mystery. When it went well, it was a miracle. When it went wrong, it was a curse, and the fear didn't end once the baby was born. The church taught that if a child died before baptism, its soul would be trapped in limbo forever. That's why priests were sometimes rushed into birthing chambers, standing by as women screamed, ready to baptize the infant the moment it emerged. If a stillbirth occurred, the panic was not only for the grieving mother, but for the eternal fate of the child. This is why childbirth wasn't just a physical ordeal, it was a spiritual battlefield. A mother risked not only her body, but also her soul, and her child's soul too. But superstition was only part of the nightmare. The brutal physical realities of medieval childbirth were worse. In the next part, we'll step into the birthing room itself. We'll see what women endured: the screams, the blood, the crude tools, and the desperate attempts of midwives to save lives in conditions that make modern surgery look like magic. This is where childbirth turns from painful to horrifying. Picture this: a dimly lit chamber, heavy with the smell of smoke and sweat. A fire burns in the hearth, not only to keep the room warm, but to drive away evil spirits thought to lurk around women in labor. The windows are shuttered tight. Light is considered dangerous, so the room is cloaked in shadows. Only women are allowed inside, no men, not even the husband. This was the medieval birthing room, a place of both intimacy and terror. The laboring mother is placed on a wooden birthing chair if she's lucky enough to have one. The chair has a hole in the center, armrests to grip, and sometimes ropes to pull against. If no chair is available, the woman may squat on the floor, lean against another woman, or lie on a straw-stuffed mattress. Forget comfort, every option is agony. Surrounding her are midwives and female attendants, sometimes women from the village, sometimes her own kin. These attendants chant prayers, hold her hands, or press warm cloths against her forehead. They murmur encouragement, though all know how dangerous the ordeal truly is. Many of them have buried mothers, sisters, or daughters who never survived this moment. The midwife, the most vital figure, brings her small pouch of tools and remedies. She may carry sharp knives or razors, not for surgical precision, but for desperate measures, such as cutting the umbilical cord or performing a crude last resort operation. She has herbs for pain relief, penarial, mugwort, and sometimes poppy, but these herbs are weak compared to the relentless torment of childbirth. If the baby is turned the wrong way, the midwife must attempt to twist it by hand, reaching inside with bare fingers, praying she can maneuver it before both mother and child suffocate. There are no gloves, no sterilization, just raw desperation. If the mother is exhausted, attendants may strap cloths around her stomach and physically push down on her belly to force the baby out. The cries in this room are not just from the mother, but from everyone present. The sound of ripping flesh, the heavy gasps, the scent of blood mixing with incense. This was the soundtrack of medieval birth. And then, there was the ever-present possibility of death. If the baby became stuck, there were horrifying procedures. In some cases, if the child was deemed already dead, the midwife or later, a surgeon would attempt to dismember the fetus inside the womb and remove it piece by piece to save the mother's life. Imagine the trauma, both physical and emotional, of enduring such a brutal procedure. And remember, anesthesia did not exist. But more often, the reverse was true: the child might be saved at the expense of the mother. A midwife could sometimes deliver the baby with force, but if the mother hemorrhaged afterward, there was little anyone could do. Some women bled to death in minutes. Others died days later from infection, fever creeping through their bodies, while their newborns wailed helplessly in the cradle. Even survival carried scars. Many women were left with what we now know as fistulas, tearing so severe that they lost control over bodily functions for the rest of their lives. These women were often shunned, abandoned by husbands, or forced into convents. Their suffering was a lifelong sentence, a cruel reminder of what childbirth had taken from them. And yet, despite this horror, childbirth was so common that it was treated as an ordinary part of life. For noble women, it was practically a duty to endure this again and again, producing heirs for their dynasties. For peasants, it was simply survival, ensuring enough children lived to adulthood to work the land. Women did not expect mercy from their own bodies, but the story of medieval childbirth isn't just one of penance, also one of ritual. Every birth was layered with symbolic acts designed to protect the fragile balance between life and death. These rituals were as important as the physical labor itself. To truly understand childbirth in the Middle Ages, you have to understand that it wasn't just a medical ordeal, it was also a spiritual battlefield. For medieval women, giving birth wasn't only about surviving blood loss, infection, and exhaustion. It was also about fending off demons, curses, and the wrath of God. And so, childbirth became a ritual. The moment labor began, charms and protections were put in place. A priest might bless the mother before the pains started, sprinkling holy water across her swollen belly. Sometimes relics were brought into the birthing chamber bones of saints. Fragments of the true cross, or even the Virgin Mary's veil, if a church possessed such a relic. These objects were placed near the mother or tied around her body, believed to keep evil spirits at bay. Words carried power to medieval people believed in the protective force of Scripture. So verses from the Psalms were written on scraps of parchment and tied to the woman's thigh or placed under her pillow. One common charm was Psalm 51, the Miserere, a plea for God's mercy. The hope was that these holy words would shield both mother and child from death. But alongside Christianity, older pagan traditions lingered. Herbs like mugwort and vervain weren't just used for pain relief. They were believed to have magical properties. Midwives sometimes boiled these plants and bathed the mother's stomach with the water, chanting as they did so. In some parts of Europe, women were made to step over an axe or a sword before labor, a ritual meant to cut through the difficulties of childbirth. Then there were the stranger practices. If a woman's labor stalled, attendants might pour melted wax from a church candle into her hand, believing the holy flame would ignite the birth. In other cases, if the baby seemed trapped, prayers were offered to obscure saints. Known for aiding mothers, Saint Margaret of Antioch was especially popular. Legend said she had once been swallowed by a dragon and then burst free, miraculously unharmed. For medieval women, this symbolized a child escaping the womb. The rituals weren't always comforting. Sometimes they reflected the deep fear that surrounded childbirth. For example, women in some regions were forbidden from crying out too loudly, as screams were thought to attract demons lurking near the birthing chamber. Others believed that opening every lock and latch in the house, from doors to chests to cabinets, would unlock the womb. Husbands would hurry from room to room, fumbling with bolts and hinges, while their wives screamed in agony behind closed doors. Even after delivery, rituals continued. If a baby was weak or stillborn, panic erupted. A priest might be summoned immediately for a desperate emergency baptism. In some cases, the midwife herself would quickly baptize the infant by sprinkling water, because if a baby died unbaptized, its soul was believed to be doomed to limbo. Mothers who lost children carried the terrible weight of believing their infants were denied heaven, an agony that only deepened their grief. And if the mother survived, she too had to undergo ritual cleansing. Medieval people saw childbirth as not only dangerous, but also polluting. A woman was considered unclean after delivery, and she could not return to church until she had undergone a purification rite called churching. This ceremony, performed weeks after birth, symbolically cleansed her from the taint of childbirth and reintroduced her into the spiritual community. For noble families, childbirth was also wrapped in political ritual. The birth of an heir could determine the future of a kingdom, and so the event was treated almost like a coronation. Witnesses were required in the room to confirm the child's legitimacy, ensuring no deception took place. Sometimes, dozens of people crowded the birthing chamber, turning the mother's agony into a public spectacle. She might scream in pain, but she was expected to bear it with dignity because her suffering was tied to dynastic power. Yet, despite all these charms, prayers, and rituals, death often came anyway. And when it did, the explanations were just as steeped in superstition. A mother's death in childbirth might be blamed on witchcraft. Perhaps a jealous neighbor had cursed her womb. Or it might be said that the woman had been punished for her sins, that God himself had sealed her fate. What we see in all of this is the medieval struggle to make sense of the uncontrollable. Childbirth was the most unpredictable moment of a woman's life. No one could guarantee survival, so people turned to faith, magic, and tradition to fill that void. For the women themselves, these rituals were sometimes comforting, sometimes terrifying, but they were always inescapable. If rituals, relics, and prayers couldn't keep death away, then all that remained was the grim reality of medieval medicine. But because of childbirth itself, the dangers began even before labor. Pregnancy placed enormous strain on the body, let alone treated. A swelling of the face or seizures might simply be blamed on bad humors, demonic influence, or punishment from God. Then came the labor itself. For hours, sometimes days, a woman would endure waves of excruciating pain. Prolonged labor was incredibly dangerous, and without surgical intervention, the baby could become trapped in the birth canal. The mother might die of exhaustion, hemorrhage, or internal rupture. In some cases, both mother and child perished together, using their hands to twist or push the infant into a better position. Without sterile conditions, this often introduced deadly infections. In more desperate situations, a horrific procedure might be attempted. The use of hooks or knives to cut apart the fetus inside the womb so it could be removed in pieces. This solution almost always killed the child and, often the mother as well. Cesarean sections existed in theory, but they were not performed to save living mothers. Instead, they were typically carried out only after the mother had already died or was dying, as a last-ditch attempt to rescue the baby, or at least to baptize it before death. For women, it was essentially a death sentence. But even when the baby was delivered safely, the danger was far from over. Postpartum infections, what we now call childbed fever, were among the deadliest killers, carrying invisible death with them. Fevers would set in within days, the woman's body racked with chills, sweats, and unbearable pain. For many, it was a slow and agonizing death. Blood loss was another constant threat. There were no blood transfusions, no surgical repairs for ruptured tissues, or red wine were applied in hopes of strengthening the blood, but they did little more than offer false hope. And then there were the diseases that lurked in the background, ready to complicate any birth. Syphilis, which spread through Europe by the late Middle Ages, could infect newborns, leaving them with grotesque deformities or causing them to die shortly after birth. Tuberculosis, smallpox, or even leprosy could all pass from mother to child. Each birth carried not only the risk of death in the moment, but also the looming shadow of lifelong illness. Aristocratic mothers were expected to produce multiple heirs, one after another, with little time for recovery. Queens and princesses often endured a dozen or more pregnancies, each one taking a toll on their bodies. Physicians offered little help. They still subscribed to the ancient theories of humors believing. The body was governed by the balance of blood. If a woman struggled in childbirth, a physician might prescribe bloodletting to release excess humors. Imagine it. A woman already weakened from hours of labor, now drained of blood in the name of healing. Other cures were equally bizarre. Some physicians recommended placing a live weasel around the mother's neck, believing the animal's energy would help her deliver. Others advised giving her concoctions of wine, mixed with herbs like rue or wormwood plants that could sometimes ease pain, but just as often acted as poisons. The horror of all this is not just in the suffering, but in the acceptance of it. Women wrote wills when they became pregnant, knowing that labor might be their last act on earth. Families prepared shrouds alongside baby clothes, and priests were often on standby, ready to perform last rites before the child even took its first breath. But childbirth was not only a struggle for life, it was also deeply tied to the church, to morality, and to how women were viewed in society. In the next part, we'll explore the religious dimensions of childbirth, how sin, purity, and divine judgment shaped the experience, and why women were told their suffering was not just natural but sacred. To fully understand the brutality of childbirth in the Middle Ages, we can't just look at the medical dangers. We also have to examine the heavy religious weight that surrounded it, weight that shaped how women saw themselves, how they were treated, and how society justified their suffering. For medieval Christians, childbirth wasn't just a biological event. It was a theological one. Every cry of pain, every drop of blood, every death in childbed, these were seen through the lens of the Bible. The story of Eve loomed over every pregnant woman. According to Genesis, Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden brought suffering into the world. and God's punishment was clear. I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain, you will give birth to children. To medieval society, this wasn't metaphor, it was divine law. This belief was repeated by priests, theologians, and even physicians. Women were told that their agony in childbirth was not only natural, but sacred. It was their burden, their punishment, and their duty. To cry out against it was not just a sign of weakness, but a sign of rebellion against God's will. Imagine being a young mother, writhing in labor, terrified of death and being told that this was the price for humanity's original sin. But the church's influence went further. Women were considered unclean after giving birth. Regardless of whether it went smoothly or not, the blood of childbirth was seen as polluting, a stain on the body and the soul. For 40 days after giving birth to a son and 80 days after giving birth to a daughter, woman was barred from entering the church. She was excluded from the sacraments, treated as spiritually tainted. Only after a ritual purification, often called the churching of women, could she rejoin her community in full. This separation reinforced a cruel message that women's bodies were inherently sinful, their very ability to give life also making them impure. It created a paradox: women were celebrated as mothers, yet condemned as vessels of sin. And then there was the question of the child's soul. For medieval parents, nothing was more urgent than baptism. If a baby died before being baptized, its soul was believed to be denied entry into heaven, instead trapped in a limbo state. This meant that if a child was stillborn or died during labor before baptism could be performed, its death was not only a personal tragedy, but also an eternal one. Parents mourned not just the loss of their child's life, but the loss of its salvation. This urgency often led to harrowing scenes in the birthing room. Midwives were sometimes trained to perform emergency baptisms. If it looked like the child might not survive, imagine the panic between screams of the mother and the chaos of delivery. Someone rushing to sprinkle water over a newborn's head, whispering hurried prayers, desperate to save its soul. If no water was available, some traditions even allowed for baptism with wine, milk, or saliva, anything, to ensure the child would not be lost forever. But what about the mothers themselves? Their salvation was tied not to baptism, but to endurance. A woman who faced childbirth with piety and submission was seen as virtuous, even saintly. Her suffering could be offered up to God, compared to the martyrdom of saints. Some sermons even praised women who died in childbirth, calling them martyrs of motherhood. But unlike martyrs who died for their faith, these women died because society demanded they fulfill their duty. At the same time, there were whispers of the supernatural. If childbirth went wrong, if a woman labored for too long, if the baby was deformed, if the mother died, it was sometimes blamed not on nature or poor health, but on witchcraft. Accusations might fall on midwives, who were often the most knowledgeable about childbirth. Their herbs and charms, their secret knowledge, made them both indispensable and deeply mistrusted. Were they healers or servants of the devil? This tension simmered for centuries, and in later times, during witch hunts, midwives would often be targeted as scapegoats. Even the idea of pain relief was tangled up in religion. Herbal remedies like opium, poppy, mandrake, or henbane could dull labor pains, but many priests condemned their use. Why? Because they believed women were meant to suffer. To ease that suffering was to defy God's will. In some cases, giving a woman pain relief was even considered a sin. And so, women were trapped in a cruel cycle. Condemned if they cried out. Condemned if they sought relief. Condemned if they failed to give birth. Condemned if they succeeded but bore daughters instead of sons. Every outcome carried the weight of judgment. Yet, despite this suffocating religious framework, women found ways to carve out strength. They formed sisterhoods of survival, supporting each other in childbirth, sharing knowledge that priests dismissed, whispering prayers that blended Christianity with ancient folk traditions. In their darkest hours, women looked not just to saints, but to each other. Still, the Church's teachings left deep scars. For generations, women entered labor not only fearing for their bodies, but fearing for their souls. And that fear shaped the way childbirth was remembered, recorded, and even imagined. But childbirth didn't end with delivery or purification rituals. The ordeal often continued long after the baby was born. In the next part, we'll explore the postpartum world of medieval women, the confinement, the dangers that lingered after birth, and the often ignored toll childbirth took on their minds and bodies. When the cries of labor finally ceased, and the child was brought into the world, many would assume the ordeal was over. But for medieval mothers, the real battle had only just begun. Childbirth didn't end at delivery, it lingered in the shadows of the days, weeks, and even months that followed. This was the postpartum world of the Middle Ages, a world of hidden dangers, strange customs, and quiet suffering. One of the most common practices was lying-in, a period of enforced rest and seclusion for new mothers. After birth, a woman was expected to remain indoors, confined to her bed or chamber for weeks. The stated reason was recovery. Her body was weakened, her womb open, and her health fragile. But the ritual also carried heavy undertones of impurity. She was still considered spiritually unclean until her churching ceremony, which might not happen for 40 or 80 days. Until then, she was kept apart from religious life, and sometimes from society itself. For wealthier women, lying in could mean a kind of luxurious retreat. They were surrounded by attendants, nourished with special diets, and tended to as they regained strength. In noble households, the lying-in chamber might even be decorated with rich fabrics, charms, and holy icons to protect both mother and child from illness and evil spirits. It was a blend of comfort and superstition. But for peasant women, lying in was far harsher. Few could afford weeks of rest. A mother might be expected to return to work in the fields or at the hearth within days of giving birth. Her body still bleeding, her wound still raw. The idea of confinement was often impractical for the poor, and so many women pushed themselves back into labor this time of a different kind before they had healed. Unsurprisingly, this led to devastating health problems. Hemorrhage, infection, or a condition we would now recognize as prolapse, where the weakened muscles of the womb gave way under strain. And then there were the postpartum fevers. Medieval women lived under constant threat of infection. With no knowledge of bacteria, unwashed hands and dirty linens introduced deadly illnesses into the birthing chamber. Midwives often reused instruments without cleaning them. The placenta might not be fully expelled, leaving decaying tissue inside the womb. Within days, a fever would set in what we now call puerperal fever, a common killer of mothers well into the 19th century. In the Middle Ages, it was almost a death sentence. Entire villages whispered of women who seemed to recover, only to fall sick days later, their bodies consumed by fever and rot. But the physical dangers were only part of the story. Medieval records rarely mention it. But it's almost certain that women suffered from postpartum depression and other mental health struggles, just as they do today. Imagine a young mother, perhaps barely a teenager, isolated in her chamber, bleeding and exhausted, with an infant who might not survive the winter. There were no words for her despair, no space for her sorrow. Her tears might be dismissed as weakness, or even as signs of spiritual failing. Some women simply slipped into silence, their pain unnoticed, their suffering forgotten. And yet, amid all this, there was also ritual and superstition designed to shield mother and child. Babies were swaddled tightly in strips of cloth, a practice believed to shape their limbs and protect them from harm. Amulets might be tied around their necks, from bits of coral to tiny crosses, guarding them against evil spirits or the dreaded evil eye. Mothers might wear protective charms themselves, or whisper incantations as they nursed. Christianity and folk belief intertwined, creating a fragile shield of prayers, herbs, and charms against the unknown. Breastfeeding, too, carried its own pressures. Ideally, a mother was expected to nurse her child. But among the nobility, it was common to hire wet nurses, women paid to feed the infant. This was not always an act of cruelty, freed aristocratic women from the exhausting demands of nursing, allowing them to conceive again sooner, which was often expected of them. But it created another layer of danger, as some wet nurses might neglect or mistreat the child in their care. For peasant women, there was no choice. They breastfed if they could, often while still working, their babies slung across their bodies as they toiled. Malnutrition, however, often meant their milk supply was weak. In desperation, some mothers fed infants bread soaked in milk, honey, or even ale foods far too harsh for fragile newborn stomachs, often leading to illness or death. Every stage of postpartum life was shadowed by risk. The mother's body was weak, the baby's survival uncertain, and the community's judgment heavy. If a woman failed to recover quickly, she was seen as frail. If she died, it was dismissed as God's will. If her baby died, she might be whispered about, even blamed, as though her failure of Karor, her sins, had brought misfortune upon the child. And yet, despite this relentless pressure, medieval women persisted. They endured. They carried on with the quiet strength of survival, creating life in a world that gave them so little safety, so little compassion. But childbirth was not just a private ordeal, it was also political. The lives of queens and noblewomen were bound up in dynasties, heirs, and power. The survival of empires often rested on a single womb. In the final part, we'll look at the royal realities of childbirth, where queens faced not only the same agonies as common women, but the crushing weight of entire kingdoms on their shoulders. For a peasant woman, childbirth was about survival. For a queen, childbirth was about survival in politics. A mother's life, a child's cry, even the sex of a newborn could decide the fate of kingdoms. Nowhere was childbirth more brutal or more consequential than in the glittering but deadly world of medieval royalty. The womb of a queen was not her own. It belonged to her husband, to his dynasty, to his advisors, and to the ambitions of the state. The expectation was simple. Produce heirs, preferably sons, and secure the succession. Anything less was failure. Imagine the weight of that burden, lying heavy on a young queen's shoulders as she entered her wedding bed. She knew that her worth as a wife, as a ruler, even as a human being, was measured by the children she produced. But this was no fairy tale of crowns and gowns. It was a story of relentless pregnancy, of one birth followed by another, often before a woman had even healed from the last. Catherine of Aragon, for example, the first wife of Henry VIII, endured at least 6 pregnancies, most ending in stillbirths or the deaths of her infants. Only one child, Mary Tudor, survived. Each loss was not just a personal tragedy, but a political disaster. Whispers began. Was the queen cursed? Was she sinful? Was God punishing her womb? The dangers of childbirth were magnified at court. Queens gave birth, surrounded not only by midwives, but by courtiers, physicians, and attendants, all watching, all waiting. In France, it became customary for noblemen and ladies to crowd the queen's chamber during labor. A public performance of dynastic legitimacy. The child's birth was a spectacle, not a private moment of pain. One queen reportedly labored in front of more than 200 witnesses, a horrifying invasion of intimacy at the most vulnerable moment of her life. And yet, despite their wealth, queens suffered the same agonies as peasant women. They bled, they tore, they screamed, and they died. Some deaths shook entire kingdoms. Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, gave him the long-awaited son he craved, but she died just days later of postpartum complications. Henry celebrated his heir, but mourned his queen, the price of succession paid in blood. Then there was Isabella of Bavaria, Queen of France in the 14th century. Married at just 14 years old, she was thrust into pregnancy almost immediately. By the time she was 19, she had already endured multiple births, her body breaking under the strain. She would eventually bear 12 children, each pregnancy draining her strength. Yet each child representing a pawn in the great game of dynastic politics. Royal childbirth also carried religious weight. If a queen failed to produce sons, she might be seen as an obstacle to God's will, or worse, as a dangerous influence leading the kingdom astray. Dynastic failure could justify annulments, divorces, or even accusations of witchcraft. Women who bled and suffered in childbirth might also be whispered about in hushed tones, accused of bringing curses upon the throne. And what of the children themselves? Their survival was as precarious as their mothers. Infant mortality did not spare royalty. Edward VI of England, Henry VIII's only legitimate son, lived only 15 years. The deaths of heirs destabilized entire dynasties, sparking wars and rebellions. In this sense, a queen's labor pains reverberated far beyond her chamber walls. They could plunge nations into chaos. One of the most chilling aspects of royal childbirth was the pressure to keep producing, no matter the cost. A queen might emerge from one birth feverish and weak, only to be forced back into the marital bed within weeks. Her health, her sanity, her very life were expendable, so long as she fulfilled her duty. Some women bore children until their bodies quite literally broke apart, their deaths treated as collateral damage in the pursuit of dynastic continuity. And yet, there were moments of triumph, women who defied the odds, who gave birth not only to heirs, but to legends. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance, survived at least 10 pregnancies, living into her 80s and leaving behind one of the most powerful dynastic legacies in history. Margaret of Anjou, though tormented by political strife, endured the dangers of childbirth to secure her son's place in the Wars of the Roses. These women, and others like them, stood at the crossroads of power and pain, their wombs the battlegrounds of history. When we look back at medieval childbirth, whether in the mud huts of peasants or the gilded chambers of queens, one truth emerges. The experience was brutal, relentless, and often deadly. Women gave life at unimaginable cost, their suffering overlooked, their voices silenced. Yet without them, without their courage, their endurance, their sacrifice, our history would not exist. So, the next time we hear tales of kings and conquests, of battles and crowns, remember the hidden battlefield that made it all possible, the laboring chambers of medieval women. Their cries shaped dynasties, their blood built empires. Their pain was the foundation upon which history was written, and if this story has gripped you, if it has opened your eyes to the forgotten struggles of the past, I invite you to stay with us here on Past of Medieval. We dive deep into the hidden, the brutal, and the fascinating corners of history stories that deserve to be heard. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell, so you never miss another journey into the shadows of our past.